All right, welcome to our IBM Garage Cloud Native Toolkit office hours. Today we're going to be talking about IBM Cloud access control and some of um, generally how it works, how it's constructed, some of the best practices that we've kind of come across of how to use it, and then some of the tools that we have for how to automate some of that. So Bobby Wolf will be presenting today. So take it away, Bobby.
All right, thank you. Um, like Sean says, my name's Bobby Wolf, and gonna present on access management and how that works in IBM Cloud. And I'm gonna do maybe 20 minutes of lecture and kind of explain the concepts and the idea of how this stuff works. And then I'm gonna do kind of a demo to kind of show you the screens of where everything is and how to actually apply what I'm talking about. So the first thing is why do we even need this stuff? Why do we care? And basically, if you want to set up an account where all the users can do anything they want, then you don't need this talk. This talk is for when you don't want all the users to do anything they want. You want to be able to control which users can do which stuff. And here's kind of a couple of scenarios for that. First of all, one scenario is that if you're the owner of an account, you're responsible for paying for everything that anybody puts in that account. And so then that tends to make you kind of paranoid about who can create stuff and put it in your account. Because if they create really big things that are really expensive, then you're going to get stuck paying for it. So you need to let some users be able to create resources in your account, but you don't want to let everybody create resource, but you may not want to let everybody create resources in your account because you want to kind of keep that under control. You want to kind of only give that ability to a few trusted people. And it's easy to say, well, we're all adults and we're all professionals. We can all be trusted. That would never be a problem, right? Well, in my department, we have an account that a whole lot of people have access to. And over time, people have gone crazy creating all kinds of stuff. And basically, they've created so much stuff that the account has run out of resources and it's become pretty much unusable. We could always add more resources, but we don't really want to. It gets more expensive and all that. And it's just the problem is when everybody starts creating stuff, then sooner or later that gets out of control. So you probably want to try to keep that under control. Another example with all of this is that um, you can have multiple teams in an account that need to work together, and basically each development team is gonna have their own development environment. So you want the members of a team to be able to access their own development environment, but not everybody else's development environment. Especially because they're going to be able to go change stuff in their development environment, and so you want to be sure that they can change stuff only in their own environment and not everybody else's. Because again, otherwise that gets to be kind of chaotic. And within an environment, you want to have some users that can do a lot of stuff to change the environment and set it up the way you want. But then other users can't really do that. Other users just have to use the environment kind of the way it is. Um, Again, because if you let everybody change everything they feel like, then it tends to get fairly chaotic and fairly messy, and you probably don't want that to happen. So you're trying to control that better. This is how to do that. So this is a diagram right out of the documentation. This is for a feature called Identity and Access Management, IAM, which is the kind of the theme of this talk. And these are the links down here at the bottom for where you can go find these pages in the documentation. And this diagram shows the elements that are involved in managing access and their relationships. And it is accurate and it is correct. And it's also very complicated and very confusing. So basically, I'm not going to try to explain all this. I could, but it's not very helpful, I don't think. Instead, what I want to do is focus on this. These are the parts that you actually need to know. So obviously, this is a lot less than what we saw in the previous diagram, but this is the parts that you really need. So You can see here that we've got access group, policy, and resource group. So what are those things? What does that mean? First thing you need to understand is an element type called a resource. And a resource is basically anything running in the cloud, in IBM Cloud. And that it's anything that can be created out of the cloud catalog. So that means that a cluster, whether it's Kubernetes or OpenShift, that's a resource. If you have 3 OpenShift clusters, then that's 3 resources. Every service instance is a resource, whether it's a database or a Watson service or whatever, that's a resource. And in fact, the service itself is even a resource, that by controlling who can access the service itself, you can control who can create instances of the service. So that's a resource. And then we have resource group. And a resource group is a group of resources. Duh. More importantly, what they are is a bunch of resources that tend to go together and tend to be used together, typically because they're being used to support a single application. So when you deploy an application, you need to deploy it into a cluster, whether it's a microservices or a monolith, you deploy that into a cluster. But then the cluster has backend services that are bound to it for the applications to use. All that set of resources, the cluster and the services that are used to support one or more applications, generally it's helpful to group those together into a resource group. Now, separately, what we have is an access group. So an access group is a set of users who all do the same thing and therefore tend to need the same permissions. So if you're familiar with role-based access control, RBAC, this is a role. A role is a bunch of people who all do the same thing and therefore need the same set of permissions, so that either all of them can do it or none of them can do it. You can just assign the permissions once. So an example of an access group would be the developers on a development team who are developing an app. They're all working on the same app together, so they all need basically the same permissions to be able to access the environment for doing that and use that environment. Then there's policy. That resource group and access group really have nothing to do with each other per se. They're orthogonal. And then policy is what brings them together, is that an access group uses a policy to access resources in the resource group. So the policy contains permissions that are bundled up in things called roles. We'll see that. And what that does is it allows the users in the access group to be able to use certain resources in the resource group according to those permissions. So for example, we have roles called administrator and manager, and we have a service called the Kubernetes service, which is the IBM Cloud Kubernetes service, IKS. And so an administrator, so you can assign administrator and manager roles to, you can use a policy to assign administrator and manager roles to the Kubernetes service, which allows people those users to use the Kubernetes service. So let's take a step back and understand what these resources are and kind of how that ends up getting organized in IBM Cloud. This is one way of looking at IBM Cloud, and it's actually reasonably accurate. That IBM Cloud, in many ways, is basically just a big bucket of stuff that's running in the cloud. And that bucket of stuff, those things are resources. And it's, at a high enough level, from IBM's point of view, as they manage the cloud, it's just a whole bunch of resources that are running in the cloud. So here what I've got is a whole bunch of clusters and a whole bunch of services, and there's different ones for different applications and things like that. So this is accurate, but it's not a very complete way of telling the story. Because the thing is that IBM Cloud, being a public cloud, is multi-tenant. And so you can have lots of different customers using stuff. And the thing is that you want to organize that better. So the way we organize that is with accounts. And accounts solve 2 problems or provide 2 capabilities. One is billing and the other is access control. On the billing thing is that the account owner is billed for all the resources that are running in the account. And then for the access control thing is that the account owner can access all the resources in their account, but they can't access any resources in any other account. And meanwhile, the other accounts cannot access their resources. So In your account, you can access all of your resources, but the other accounts cannot access your resources. You can add users to your account, and that helps give them access to the resources in your account. But meanwhile, if you don't add users, then they won't have access to it. And so, because you haven't been added to other people's account, you don't have access to their resources. So this is the first level of control of resources. And this is where the tenants come from, is that basically in a multi-tenant system, each tenant has their own account, and each tenant uses their account to control their resources and manage that. So this is pretty good. And for a small enterprise, this might be sufficient. If they only had one development team, maybe this is all they need, although I kind of doubt that. By the way, if there's anybody who's not on mute, everybody should go on mute, please. So the thing is that for a bigger group, a bigger enterprise, they're probably not going to just have one development team. They're probably going to have lots of development teams, and they should really have a development environment for each, or at least lots of development environments. And then they probably want other environments. That they probably want environments for at least one environment for production, for hosting their production apps. And in fact, they might want a separate environment for each production app. And then they might want some environments for some other things. If they have a dedicated testing team, they might want a testing environment. They might want an environment for doing demos and demonstrations, things like that. So there's going to be lots of environments that you want to have. So an account is not enough. So what we do is we then divide an account into resource groups. And each resource group is one of these environments. So you can imagine that where you see groups A, B, and C, those could be 3 different development teams, or C could be your production environment, or B could be your testing environment or your demo environment, that sort of thing. You could have lots and lots of these. It's not very limited. The couple of things to notice about resource groups is, one, they're bounded to an account. So a single resource group cannot span multiple accounts. It's within one account. Which makes a lot of sense because, again, the people in account 2 do not want the people in account 1 to be able to use their stuff. On the other hand, a resource group can span multiple regions. So in IBM Cloud, you can set up, when you set up a resource group, you can add it to both Dallas and London, and then be able to deploy stuff to both. And that would be a good way to set things up if you want to do load balancing and failover between those 2 regions. You could do it in 2 separate resource groups, but it's kind of convenient to be able to do it in one resource group. Again, the whole idea of resource groups is when you say that I want people to either be able to use everything in this resource group or nothing, then that's a good resource group. On the other hand, when you want to be able to say, well, I want some people to be able to use some resources and other people to be able to use other resources, that's a bad resource group. You basically want to divide it into 2 resource groups to say, well, everybody gets this group, these people get access to this one group, and these other people get access to this other group, and we keep them separate that way. And then you can have some people who get access to both groups if you want, and that's fine too. So that's what resource groups are. And on this diagram, we've got resource groups down here at the bottom. So we've been talking about that. That's where a resource group comes from. It's typically a cluster and a set of services that go with the cluster. So then the next thing you need to do is create an access group, which is what we show up here. And an access group basically is a bunch of users. It's kind of more complicated than that, but that's basically the way this works. And so when you have a bunch of users who all are going to do the same thing and therefore should have the same permissions, then you want to put them in an access group. And then you want to have different access groups for different roles, different types of users of the system. So as we'll see, typically you have like admins and users, and admins have rights that the users don't have. So here we've shown one access group with some users in it. And we've got, so we've got an access group that has some users in it and a resource group that has some resources in it. Now, the thing is, they have nothing to do with each other. So how do you bridge the gap? How do you connect an access group to a resource group to make them work together? And the way you do that is with policies. So as you can see, a access group can and usually does have multiple policies. Multiple policies can use the same resource group. Each policy can use its own resource group. So in theory, they can use different ones, but don't really do that because that just gets really complicated. Generally, what you're going to do is set up several policies that all use the same resource group that allow the users to use different resources in the resource group. So here what I've shown is three very common ones that we tend to see a lot, which is Kubernetes, which is the Kubernetes service so that you can create clusters. Registry, which is the IBM Cloud Container Registry, which is this global singleton that you don't need to create. It's already there. You just need to have access to. And then services. So this is the service catalog for all your backend services for databases and things like that. So, excuse me. So those are the three kind of real common ones that you tend to need. Also, what I've shown here is that each one has two roles, which are administrator and manager. So this is admin kind of stuff. It's not that you always have two roles. It's not that you can only have two roles. This is just an example. But each role is a bundle of permissions. And the roles are already predefined for you. They're built into IBM Cloud. They vary. Different services have different sort of roles, but they're all built into the service and part of the cloud. So as a user, you don't create your own roles. What you do, as we'll see in the screens in the demo, is that when you're creating a policy, you go choose roles. And so from the predefined list of roles, you choose which ones that you want the policy to have. So real commonly for administrators, the two roles that you give them is administer and manage. So that's kind of what's shown here. So some best practices around doing this stuff. Again, if you remember that first diagram, the good news about IAM is that it's very fine-grained and very flexible, and you can do a whole lot of stuff. The bad news is you can do a whole lot of stuff, and it gives you plenty of rope to hang yourself. And so here what I'm doing is I'm giving some recommendations as to you don't have to do it this way, but boy, things work a lot better if you do it this way. And this helps reinforce the diagram that I have over here, and it helps reinforce why that diagram is kind of all you really need to know. So first of all, there is a access group called default that when you get a new account, it has exactly one access. I'm sorry, did I say access group? I meant to say resource group. It has exactly one resource group called default. It's already built in there for you. Don't use it. If you have a free account, it's all you get, so you have to use it. But if you have a paid account, which is how you do all this stuff, then just kind of ignore default. You can use it if you want to, but generally you're not going to. Instead, think of all the different environments that you want to set up, or at least think of the first couple that you can come up with. That you got 3 development teams, so you want 3 development environments. Go ahead and create resource groups for those, and then as you create resources for those, put them in those resource groups. A funny thing about the way resources and resource groups work is that when you create a resource, you have to assign it to a resource group. And once you do, you can't change that. So that resource will always exist in that resource group. You'll never be able to move it to another resource group as far as I know. So think about what you want your resource groups to be, then start create those, then create your resources and put them in the right groups because that's where they're going to live for their lifetime. Now you can think of more resource groups and create more, and that's fine. But what you can't do is just sort of move things around amongst resource groups. So think about kind of how you want to have this set up and do it that way. When you start creating policies, do not assign them to users, assign them to access groups. And the reason that is really useful is because what you don't want to do is say, well, Steve needs to do these 3 things, so I'm going to create 3 policies and assign them to Steve. And then Lori needs to do the same 3 things, so I'm going to create 3 more policies just like it and assign them to Lori. And then Joe needs to do the same 3 things, and so I'm going to create 3 more policies and assign them to him. You're going to end up with a huge number of policies, and you're going to end up with a huge mess that you can't kind of keep track of what in the heck you did, and you're not going to be able to manage. Instead, what you want to do is create an access group and put all 3 of those people in it, and then assign that access group one set of policies. So those same 3 policies, but you're assigning it to the group, not the user. And that way, everybody in the group gets those policies. And that way, if you want to add a policy, you just add it to the group. You don't have to go add it to Steve and Lori and Joe over and over again. You just add it to the group once. You got one policy. That's much easier to manage. So think of these access groups as roles, and when you want to give somebody policies, don't assign it to the user. Think of what role that user is fulfilling, and stick that user in that role in that access group and assign the policies to the groups. Um, then a policy needs to point to a resource group, and what you should do is you should use the resource group to assign access. You can have a policy point to a specific resource. Don't do that because there's lots of them and you'll end up with lots of policies and it'll be a big mess. You can assign a policy to the account, which means all resource groups in the account. That's a good habit for kind of super user kind of admins, and I'll show you that. But in general, that's not a good habit for most of the users in the system. Most of the users in the system should only be using one environment that's in one resource group. So assign them access to that resource group. Do not assign them access to any of the other resource groups because they're not supposed to be floating around in there anyway. That's going to be much easier to manage. Again, the whole idea here is to cut down on the number of policies that you're creating so that you can keep track of which ones you actually have and keep track of what's going on. All right. So far, what I've talked about is how identity and access management works in IBM Cloud. All of this applies to IBM Cloud in general. If you have an IBM Cloud account, then all of this works the way I just described. Now what I'm going to describe is what my team does. Is we are developing I think of it as a platform called the Cloud Native Toolkit. And this is the way we use access groups within this toolkit. So on the one hand, it's specific for the toolkit and the development environments that it sets up. But on the other hand, however you're going to use IBM Cloud, whether or not you use our toolkit, if you're going to create environments for development teams and for hosting production apps and that sort of thing, you're probably going to want to follow these practices too. Let's see. So what we've got here is 3 different access groups, or in a way, sort of types of access groups at 3 different levels. Now, there really is no type of access group, and access groups are not hierarchical, so the levels thing is a little confusing. But basically, what I mean by that is that this type of access group at the top, the account admin, has lots and lots of privileges. They can do almost anything. The one in the middle has some privileges, and the one at the bottom, the environment user, has only a few privileges. So that's what I mean by levels. They're all just access groups, but one of them has way more policies, or the policies are way broader. So an account admin can administer just about anything in the account. And you can limit that some, but in general, you give them very broad access. And the point of having this group is that the account owner does not want to be the only person managing an account, because when an account has hundreds or thousands of users in it and thousands of resources and so on, the account owner is going to be just way too busy 24/7. So he or she is going to want to be able to delegate to some admins. So that's these account admins. Is the account admins have all the privileges of the account owner, or at least lots of them, most of them. And so that way, the account owner can delegate to these account admins. The account admins are going to do a lot of the the basic stuff that we need to set up to install the toolkit as one of these development environments. So you need to set up some VLANs. We talked about resource groups. The account admins are the ones who set up the resource groups and the access groups, all that kind of stuff. So all this IAM stuff that I've been talking about, the way that that's going to get set up is it's going to be set up by these account admins. An environment administrator is somebody who can administer one environment, but meanwhile can't touch any of the others. So within that one environment, again, they have very broad permissions to create services and delete them and change things around and make the environment the way you want. But on the other hand, they can't change the other environments. And then environment users are people that can use the resources in an environment, but only one environment. They can't use the other environments. And while they use those resources, they can change the configuration of the existing resources, but they can't create new ones. They can't delete old ones. And this is really important, that if your whole development team is using a cluster to develop its application, and one of these, and somebody deletes that cluster, that's going to be really bad for the whole team. So you really want to limit who can create and delete clusters and things like that. And so these environment administrators can create delete clusters. The environment users can't. That's sort of the separation between the two. But the environment administrators can only do it within their one environment, their one resource group, whereas the account administrators can do it in any resource group because they're the ones who created the resource groups in the first place. Um, so what the users can end up doing is they can run things like they can deploy apps, they can run the CI/CD pipeline, stuff like that. But what they can't do is create new services or delete old ones. All right, that is the presentation. That's the lecture and concepts part. So let's get into the demo. So what I have set up here is I don't want to do there, is I have two users and I have them logged into two browsers. So this is Chrome and this is my user. Well, they're both my users, but this is my account admin user that basically has a whole lot of almost super user kind of access within the account and can do almost anything. And then what I have here is my is a sample kind of user who has very limited access. And in fact, I've already given them more access than I meant to. So let me get rid of that real quick. And the way I could tell that he had more access than I wanted him to is because he can see some of the clusters and services and stuff. What I really want to show is this, which is here. Yeah, update, please. Here, he doesn't have access to much of anything. That if he goes to the resource list, he doesn't have access to anything. And the reason why is because within his access group, he doesn't have any, he's not a member of any group. He's just a member of public access. So let me show you how these access groups are set up. Let me show you how to do resource groups. So what I'm going to show you here is some screens that as a user in IBM Cloud, you often don't ever get to see. So this is kind of how this stuff works. And if you have enough access, you can actually do it yourself. But most of the time you can't. So you're logged into IBM Cloud. This is the dashboard. You're in the right paid account that where you're an administrator and you're allowed to do this kind of stuff. And so you go to manage and account. And when you go there, there's a bunch of stuff that I'm really not going to worry about so much right now. But what, but the thing that I want to talk about is resource groups. So you go to resource groups, and here's the list of resource groups that we've defined in our account. And one that we use a lot for development and testing and demos like this is this one here called Garage Dev Tools. So you notice there's really not much to to a resource group. It's mostly just a name. When you go in there, I don't want to manage access. No, I don't want to do that. That's not what I was looking for. Is here's where you can create resources and add them into that resource group, which really isn't that exciting. So, there's just really not that much to see about a resource group except that it exists. That's the main part. Then what you do is you go to access, which is IAM, this identity and access management. And here is where you can manage users and access groups and things like that. There's also API keys tend to be useful, but mostly what I'm going to talk about is access groups and how we add users to the access groups. So again, just to help myself out, I've got this tab open on the user that I'm using in this other browser, so I can easily change that. But I'm going to go here to access groups. And what I want to show you is that we've created three different access groups. There's obviously more than three here, but I'm going to show you three of them where what we've done is here in one of our GitHub repos for what we call iteration 0, we have a directory under here called scripts. And in scripts, we have three script files called ACP, account, admin, and user. So what I've done is I've run those three scripts three times, and once each. And I created this access group called account admin. Then I created two called Garage Tools admin and Garage Tools user. So part of what I didn't explain, let me explain this a little better on here. I'll go back to this real quick. Is that account admin, you tend to only need to have one of these per account because these are the administrators per account. Environment admin and user admin, you tend to have one of these per environment. So there's who can create and manage the environment. Those are the admins. And then there's who can use the environment but really can't change it. Those are the users. So you only have one of these, which means you only run this script once, basically, is probably all you need. You can do it more if you want to or if you need to, but generally you only need to run it once. And then, but environment admin and environment user, you're going to run that script once per environment. So if you create three different environments, then you're going to run this pair of scripts three different times to create three different access groups. I hope that makes sense. So what I've done so far is I've run it once to set up three different ones. So I'll start at the bottom and work my way up. That here is the one for users, and in the policies, what you see is that I've assigned three different policies. So it's like I was talking about before. If you remember this diagram here, where I said there's three policies that you tend to need all the time, then let me go back here and say, here are those three policies. That this is the one for using the Kubernetes service. This is the one for using the registry. And then this is the one for using the rest of the service catalog, all the different services. And in each case, you'll notice that I have it limited to a particular resource group. So what this means is that these users can use anything that's in this resource group, but they can't use anything that are in the other resource groups. So this lets them use their environment, but they can't use any other environment. And then you get into these roles. So let me show you, for example, for Kubernetes service. Is again, this list of roles is predefined. All I can do is check them yes or no. Do I want this or do I not? So what we're doing for users is that we're saying they're not allowed to create clusters and they're not allowed to change around a cluster, like add nodes or something like that. But they are allowed to do operator stuff, which basically means configuring stuff within the cluster that already exists. They can certainly see it and operate it. And then that means that once you have an instance, then you can look at it, you can change it, and you can actually manage it. And you can actually see, kind of get an idea of, so what does reader mean? These are the actual permissions. There's three of them here. So this means that they can read the cluster. It means they can read the tags that are on the cluster, and it means that they can read the admin policy that's associated with the cluster. And then writer says that you can write to the cluster and read the others. And manager says that you can manage the cluster. And here's a big long explanation of what that entails, of what it means to be able to manage a cluster. Mainly that you can set up RBAC within the cluster, things like that. And then again, you have the same read abilities as before. And I just go ahead and give you all three, and that way you can use whichever one. That way they've got whatever they want. The main thing is I'm trying to limit them. I don't give them editor and administrator because I don't want them to be able to create and delete clusters, and I don't want them to be able to create to change a cluster in a major way, like add or remove nodes or stuff like that. So that is the user role, which is the most basic one. Then what I'll show you is the environment admin role. And again, this is the one that enables you to, on the one hand, do all kinds of stuff within a particular environment, but on the other hand, you can't mess with any of the other environments. You can only mess with your own. So the sorts of stuff that you want to be able to do, again, is like we talked about before, you want to be able to mess with Kubernetes clusters, you want to be able to use the registry, and you want to be able to use all services in the catalog. Now, and again, you'll notice that it's limited to the resource group for a particular environment. So that way they can't mess with other environments. Then you have this viewer thing down here at the end. And what this does is it allows the user to see the resource group itself. And why that's really important is because when you go to create a resource, you need to be able to choose what resource group it's going to go in. So this is what controls what's in that list of resource groups that you can choose. Otherwise, you can't choose a resource group. You can, and even though you have permissions to create clusters and to create services, you can't actually put them in any resource groups. This is what gives you the ability to see that resource group and put stuff in there. So with like the Kubernetes service, we'll look at the permissions that it has, and you'll notice that one of the ones is cluster create. That's the one that you want to be kind of careful about. So that's what we get from administrator, which is why you don't want most people to be an administrator. Even with an editor, you can read the cluster and you can update the cluster, but you can't create the cluster. Generally, we don't want users to be able to update clusters either, but we want administrators to be able to, and so it's okay for them to have that. They've got cluster update. And then once a cluster is created, we want them to be able to manage it. So we give them all the manager stuff that the users have too. So you can think about, do you really want the users to be able to manage the clusters, or do you want to limit that to the administrators? But we've kind of said, well, let the users do whatever they want to an existing instance. We just won't let them change to other instances. So you can see a similar theme for the all services, that we want them to be able to edit, and to manage edit is all you need to be able to create services. So that's sufficient. So that's kind of what's set up here for the admin. And one thing to notice about the admin is that they have the ability to create clusters. Some teams are going to want to, when they use our environment, at least the Cloud Native Toolkit, some teams are going to want to allow each environment administrator to install the entire environment, including creating a cluster. Other ones are going to say, no, the account administrator is going to create the cluster for you, and then um, the the environment admin can only use the existing cluster. If for teams that want to do that, then this is what the script sets up by automatically. So either you'll modify the script, or you'll go in here and modify the results of the script, and you'll take away administrator and you'll switch it either to editor or to operator based on what you want to allow the administrator to be able to do. So that's the way that an environment administrator works. So then what I want to show you is the account administrator. And this one is just simply called account because there's only one of these. So the account administrator has kind of two sets of permissions. That first of all, they need to be able to manage the account. They need access to be able to add users, and they need to be able to fool around with the access groups. Now, the funny part is, if you can manage the account, then not only can you create resource groups, you can also add users and manage the access group. So these two are a little bit redundant, but I put them in there anyway just to make sure that they're in there. And then we want them to be able to do what an account administrator can do. I'm sorry, what an environment administrator can do, which is they want to be able to create kube clusters and OpenShift clusters. They want to be able to mess with the registry, and they want to be able to create service instances. Now, the difference is that before, when I showed you environment administrator, it was limited to a particular resource group. Here, for the account administrators, it's not limited to the resource group. It's for all resource groups. It's for the whole account. And so this way they can mess with any resource group that they need to, because they're the account administrators. So you're giving them really broad access to change a heck of a lot of stuff inside the account. So you really only want to have a few people who can do that. So now what I want to do is flip over here. I want to kind of show you real quickly what happens as you go around changing people's access. And then I want to finish up and allow some time for questions. So the first thing I want to show here is that because my user does not belong to any groups, he doesn't have any policies and he can't see anything. See how all these things are zero? He can't see any of the resources. And trust me, he can't do a whole heck of a lot. So what I want to do is add him to the users. And let me assign that permission. And see how all these are zeros? Let's refresh. And what we should see, if this all works right, it's loading, is, hey, look at this. Now he can see 5 clusters and 24 services and a bunch of stuff. Notice that they're all in the same resource group. Now, by comparison, what I want to show you is here is my account admin user. And when he goes to the resource list, he sees a whole bunch of stuff, 34 clusters, 103 different services, because he can see them in all kinds of different resource groups. Whereas this user can only see them in this one resource group, because this is the user for that one resource group. So they're only allowed to see the resources that are in that resource group. They can't see anything else. What I can also show is that if you try to go and create a service, it won't let you. So we're going to choose App ID because you can create one real fast. We'll do it in Dallas because it doesn't matter. We'll choose a paid tier. Anyway, we're getting this stuff bound down here at the bottom. We can't choose a resource group. We don't have permissions. The create button is disabled. You know, this user cannot create stuff like this. The same thing for Kubernetes, but to save some time, I'm going to skip that for right now. So instead, what I'm going to do is go back here and I'll take them out of this group just to prove what's going on, even though it's probably not really necessary. But what I'm going to do is put them in this other group, which is the environment admins. So that means they have a whole lot of permission to work on this one environment, but they can't use any of the other environments. So when we refresh the list, we're going to see the same list of resources because they can see that as before. But because this is an admin, they get to do dangerous stuff. Like they can choose delete, and I'm not actually going to do it. Well, I don't know. I could do it, but I'm not actually going to do it. So they can actually delete these resources if they want to, whereas the user cannot. And then what I'll show is that you can actually go and create a resource. So here's the same one I was going to do before. I'll do it in Dallas, even though we don't use that one. We'll use that same plan. Here, I'm able to select the resource group because I have that permission for that. Here, I'm going to give it some neat name, Bobby Demo. And I'm going to say create, and it's going to grind for a moment. One thing I like about App ID is it creates pretty quickly. And we're going to go back to the resource group because I'm being impatient. And we're going to look at the services and we're going to see, hey, look, there's a new service called Bobby Demo. So I was actually able to create that. And because I am an admin, I'm even able to go delete it again. So admins can do a lot of stuff, but they can only do it inside of one environment. Now what I'm going to do is take them out of there. And I'm going to add them to the account one. Yeah, that's not what I'm trying to do. And choose account. Excuse me. And put them in there. And before he could see like 5 clusters and 24 services, let's refresh that. And they were all in one resource group. Now, when we refresh that, it's thinking about it. Oh, now 34 clusters and more than 100 services. And you'll notice that they're in lots of different resource groups, including some of them are in default, which means the people who created those did not listen to my talk that I'm giving right now. So, and you kind of need to take my word for it, but we can actually create a Kubernetes cluster. I'll show you that a little bit. What we're going to do is choose Kubernetes instead of OpenShift, but they're both available. Multi-zone cluster is really neat, but we don't need all that. So we're going to go to a single zone cluster. We're going to use Washington. It's figuring out the VLANs that are available for that. I would use it, make it as small as possible. But part of what's neat is the permissions checker down here says, hey, you've basically got the permissions you need. There's one little thing missing, but it doesn't matter. And we can see the VLAN, so that's a pretty good sign. So what this means is that create's probably going to work. So when you go over here and press create, it'll actually create the cluster. Whereas if I'd done it with the original user, if I'm not sure I could even get this. Well, I could probably get this far, but if I press create, it would come back real quickly. It would do some some permissions checks and go, nope, you can't do that. And so, and it wouldn't allow me to do that. So that is basically the end of my demo. So to summarize, what I want to go back to is to say, hey, you remember this diagram? Here's the way IAM works in IBM Cloud, and it's too complicated. So I'd like you to focus on this diagram here, and I'd like you to focus, on this diagram here. These are really the important parts. This is the way that you should use it to kind of maintain your own sanity. It's really a lot more flexible than this, but it'll mess you up. And so do it this way and you'll understand it a lot better. With that, Sean, I'm basically done. So I don't know what we want to do next.
So Bobby, can I just make one of the key points at this?
Sure. Go ahead, Matt.
Reason why IEM has been restructured like this, and part of the reason that enterprise subscription accounts exist in the IBM Cloud is big enterprises are really focused on cost. And when you have hundreds of random services being created by random people in an organization, the cost model gets way out of control. Yep. So the reason that you end up having this kind of, you're managing your project's cost. And one of the things that enterprise accounts do is they allow you to do a sub-account structure, and you can at a department level say, right, for the next 12 months, your OPEX cost is going to be 100K, and I'm going to track you every month with the finance team to check that you're not going over budget. So these are large enterprises managing their finances at that level. So this is part of the new world of doing proper cloud, is you need this kind of IAM access control. Just wanted to make that point. It's very much driven. Sometimes in IBM, we forget that we have access to a paid account and we can do what we like. But when you're in a client, they're very cost conscious about what they're spending their items on. So just wanted to make that point.
Okay. That's a very good point. That kind of like I mentioned at one point. If you're a small team and all you want is an account, and that's all the control that you need, then all right, then maybe that's sufficient. But if you're a larger enterprise, the larger you get, the more you need to manage this kind of stuff. And the more you need to say, not everybody gets to do everything, that certain users get to do some things and other users have to just use it the way it is. So yeah, you and I are very much in agreement.
And I'll just add to that, one of the things we learned, it's much easier to do this up front than to try to go enforce discipline later. So starting on the right foot of having access groups and only granting access via access groups, that one account access was being individually granted. So one of the difficulties is going back and finding who has particular access and what level of access they have. So having the group where you can go to and see, okay, this is the people that have access to this level of resource, and I can remove them or add them. I've also been on customers where I was trying to get be given access to the account to the level that I could provision clusters, and it took quite a while just to walk through what was needed. So to be able to say, look, here's the script to create the access group. You can look at what's in there and see what's being granted, and then if you could add me to that group and you remove me later once some of this work has been done, is a powerful thing that it makes it a lot easier to get access. But it also, the account administrators are a little more comfortable, I think, with adding people to an access group rather than trying to figure out what individual access to grant.
So Bobby,
if you create if you use access groups, then just by going and looking at an access group, you can see very easily who are all the users in that access group and what all policies does it have. And so you have a good idea of what those users can do. And if you spread that out across all the users, then it becomes a big mess and you can't figure it out. I agree.
So Bobby, could you just show one of the scripts just to show what's inside, just so it doesn't look like rocket science?
Yeah. It's so simple that I had a part in writing most of them, or most of it. So let's see. Let me go here and let me show. This is the one for doing accounts. So basically, I have a lot of documentation in here. Is mostly what it is. In fact, let me go back. Let me do the one for doing the account admin because it's simpler. Still a lot of comments, but really it only does 4 things. So here's where it gives you access to the container registry. Here is where it gives you access. Come on. I'm not seeing something. There it is. All right. It helps to scroll. Here's where you get access to the container service. Here is where you get access to the to all the IAM services, so the whole service catalog. And then here is where you get the viewer access to the resource group itself, so that you can add stuff to the resource group. So that script creates 4 policies. So if we go over here and go look at the policies, go back to that again. We're going to go to the access group and we're going to go to the admin one. And in there, what we see is that it has 4 policies. So these 4 policies that you see here are created by these 4 commands that you see in the script. Matt, is that what you wanted to see?
I think it just emphasizes that this can be automated, because most sysadmins will have this all in either Terraform or through some level of automation.
Yeah, you really want to the software-defined data center infrastructure as code. It makes this a lot easier to do repeatedly.
And clients, you can imagine, I put a comment in the chat, you can imagine a client or SRE creating a web form where a user just goes to that web form and he wants to be added to project 1, 2, 3, and then the web form just runs this script behind the scenes to add that user to the access group.
Yeah.
Bobby, can you show where from the site, from the docs sites, where the section for the admin and SRE, like, we'll get to this, for example, go to the site and then go to the admin section and it shows you here's how to set up AIM and basically points you to run this script. So it's not that this information is
I think you mean
you
the
mean the
Cognitive
guide.
the
Toolkit
toolkit.
docs, right?
The toolkit. Yeah.
You mean our guide?
Yeah. So if somebody using
Yeah,
the toolkit for the first day, where would I start? Go to the
Okay.
toolkit, and then how do I find this
Sure.
information, how to set up my.
One thing, as you're doing that real quick, though, I'll point out everything. So you can name an access group whatever you want. You can name a resource group whatever you want. You can have one access group point to multiple resource groups. We found that to stay sane, it's best to name your resource group after your access group or your access group after your resource group, so that you can quickly identify them and have a one-to-one relationship with, well, you might have multiple access groups for one resource group, but not have an access group manage multiple resource groups, just to make it easy to understand. So you can, by a naming convention, this is the admin group for this resource group, and I know what it is, and be able to, be able to find them easily and manage them easily. So that's not enforced anywhere, but by convention, that makes your life a lot easier.
The other convention that you see here is, to save confusion, we're using capitals to name an access group and lowercase for resource group. Again, it's a convention just so that you can quickly spot what is a resource group versus what is an access group. That was where that convention came from.
Right. Couple things. So I want to get to the question that Carlos is asking. But before I do that, so here in the developer guide, so let me show that, is that this is the Cloud Native Toolkit Developer Guide, which is the project that I'm working on, the team I'm part of is working on. And you go find it at cloudnativetoolkit.dev. And I've added a new section. Right now, it's only one page, which is for these office hours where you can go get these materials. So if you want to get this presentation, then this gives you the links to go find it. We're going to be posting the video of this presentation, and so I'll add it there. And then as we do other office hours over the coming weeks, we're going to add more pages under here. Then Carlos, to get to your question, is where is the documentation that says to run these scripts, how to do that? So that's a good question. So here under the administrator guide, I'll show you another page first, which is plan installation, which is the overview of the whole thing, how you have 3 different kinds of roles using this thing. So account administrators, environment administrators, environment users. That should sound real familiar. And then what each one does, who does the things in the process. And what the account administrator does is they do this part of the process called configure account. So that's this page here. And in configure account, what we do is we say you need to do a bunch of things. You need to figure out what data center you want to install your environment is. You need to make sure you have VLANs or set those up. You need to create a resource group for the whole thing. You need to update the image registry. You need to create an access group for environment admins and another access group for environment users. And then, Carlos, to your point, to your question, resource group, what we do is, the access groups is what we do is we say, then here's where to go find the script. And you use that to populate an access group where this is the convention for how we name that one. And then we say use the user script to populate the user resource group, that sort of thing. So that's in this page called configure account. Carlos, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you for showing it. And we can also add the video on this page. So it's an order. You configure the account before you start creating the new cluster. So perfect.
Right. The setting up the account administrators are kind of a chicken and egg problem. So basically, it's the account owner that has to run that script that sets up the administrators who can then do the rest of this.